The Falklands, a small group of islands in the South Atlantic, a mostly uninhabited mass of rocks that held little strategic value, yet led two nations to embark on the path of war. On the 2nd of April 1982, after more than 16 years of inconclusive diplomatic negotiations with Great Britain, Argentina launched Operativo Rosario, a military campaign designed to take by military means what the Argentine government could not secure by political means. The Argentine government miscalculated the military response of their British opponent. Refusing to accept the Argentine action, the British government responded by invasion of the Falkland Islands, a military campaign to regain her lost territory. Great Britain, a major world political power and NATO member, and Argentina, a third world nation with major power aspirations, resorted to military force to resolve their political differences over the future of a small cluster of mostly uninhabited islands in the South Atlantic. Thus began the Falkland Islands War. First, let's take a look at Argentina's political situation prior to the beginning of the war. For decades, the country remained in a state of economic degradation, with failed governments shifting at an unprecedented pace. In just 40 years, Argentina had 23 different presidents, most of whom were military generals. Military was an important pillar of Argentina's society, which dictated the order of political organization. Since 1976, a three-man military junta took over with General Jorge Rafael Videla taking the lead. What followed was a horrific period marked by political persecution, torture, and murder of opponents of the regime, a period that became known as a dirty war. Because of the unfolding events, Argentinian society became extremely divided, with those who blindly followed the military rule and those who wished for a democratic change. Because of its own misrule and Argentina's economic troubles, generals were losing whatever political legitimacy a military junta could presume to have. In December 1981, the military junta leadership was transferred to General Leopoldo Galtieri, whose goal was to unite and strengthen Argentinian society. Galtieri had to find something that would evoke national unity and make people voluntarily follow the military dictatorship. The Falkland Islands were meant to become such a unifying tool in the hands of General Galtieri. At the time, there was hardly any Argentinian who would not view the islands as their righteous territory occupied by the British. That is why a short and victorious operation in restoring Argentinian control over the Falklands would be glorified and portray a symbol of strength and progress for the struggling Argentinian masses, a long-awaited victory over cruel British colonizers. Such views were the base for the decision-making process of Argentine leaders that led them to justify the accomplishment of the task by any means necessary. Immediately, an important question arose. How did the Argentine junta plan to fight against a large British force? The short answer is that they did not plan for such a direction of events at all. The junta did not believe that the British would respond with military force. For years, Britain was in a state of degradation, losing its colonies and transforming from a major global power to a very limited European force. The British government, headed by Conservative Party Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher since May 1979, had looked to the restructuring of the military as a means to fix a bleak financial treasury and provide additional funds for a struggling domestic economy. In the South Atlantic, the British government seemed to be losing its political will. The 42 Royal Marines stationed in the Falklands, serving only as a tripwire, were certainly no match for a serious invasion force. The only British naval presence in the South Atlantic, the lightly armed Antarctic survey vessel Endurance, was to be retired in June 1982 after its current tour and not replaced. By the 1980s, the United Kingdom was, arguably, a has-been global power, whereas Argentina was trying to be a regional power. President Galtieri and his most ardent supporter of military action, Admiral Anaya, felt that Britain would not use military force to regain the Falklands, and that the UN would eventually accept the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands as a proper settlement of their long-standing claim to the islands. Thus, the Argentinian junta planned to achieve a short and bloodless victory to serve as a unifying force, failing to grasp the seriousness of a possible British response. For Britain's part, the unfolding events marked a policy failure of the British government to either cede the Falklands to Argentina or defend them with a credible deterrent presence. The British miscalculated that Argentina would not attempt to acquire by military means what Britain could not concede by diplomatic means. This assumption was reinforced by the length of the dispute, the earlier false alarms, and the consistently strident Argentine rhetoric. Verbally, Argentina had repeatedly threatened invasion. Nevertheless, Argentine troops invaded the Falklands on April 2nd, rapidly overcoming the small garrison of British Marines at the capital Port Stanley. They obeyed orders not to inflict any British casualties, despite losses to their own units. The next day, Argentine Marines seized the associated island of South Georgia. By late April, Argentina had stationed more than 10,000 troops on the Falklands, although the vast majority of these were poorly trained conscripts, and they were not supplied with proper food, clothing, and shelter for the approaching winter. The Argentinian population was overwhelmed with victory. Having created a whirlwind of public excitement and support over the invasion, Argentina's leaders were trapped in it. Immediately after mobilizing national identity by recovering the islands, it was impossible for the junta to withdraw the troops from the islands without jeopardizing their political survival. It would be portrayed as a weakness by the public and eventually lead to a certain loss of power. The British and American reactions that followed jolted the junta and its advisors. Surprised by the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands, the British government hurriedly assembled a task force that included 2 aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, and other support ships. Air assets included 20 Sea Harriers and a variety of helicopters. Thatcher made it clear that the United Kingdom would retake the Falklands militarily if Argentine troops had not left by the time British forces arrived. As a large British joint task force moved by sea to retake the islands, with indispensable US intelligence and logistics support, the junta made a second fateful decision: to stand pat and wait for hostilities with a country possessing vastly superior forces. If the decision to invade had been based on the assumption of triumph, the decision to decline the peace proposal was taken in the face of the certainty of defeat. Junta's main weapon was the Air Force, which counted 180 fighter bombers, including Mirage IIIs and A-4 Skyhawks, as well as 9 squadrons of transports, auxiliary aviation, and trainers among its 450 aircraft. Naval aviation assets supplemented this force with 130 aircraft of their own, the most formidable being 6 Super Etendards, which were capable of firing Exocet anti-ship missiles. It seemed that the best way to stop the invasion was to sink the ships in the hope of either killing the troops before they went ashore or making the cost to Britain so high that Whitehall would opt to withdraw or negotiate. On April 25th, a British force was already near the Falklands. The basic British military campaign outlined 4 main purposes. First, the establishment of a sea blockade around the Falklands. Second, the repossession of South Georgia. Third, the gaining of sea and air supremacy around the Falklands. And fourth, eventual repossession of the Falkland. The British employment of naval and ground forces was offensively oriented. Southern Force, centered around the aircraft carriers Invincible and Hermes, was designed to project power in the form of the sea blockade around the Falklands, provide the forces needed to recapture South Georgia, and provide air power needed to gain air control supremacy. The amphibious assault ships HMS Fearless and Intrepid, the last 2 remaining amphibious ships in the British inventory, along with 5 logistic landing ships, provided the necessary ships to put ground troops ashore. On May 2nd, the obsolete Argentine cruiser General Belgrano was sunk outside the war zone by a British nuclear-powered submarine. Meanwhile, the British naval force and the land-based Argentine air forces fought pitched battles. Because the Falklands were at the extreme edge of the Argentine aircraft's combat radius, the planes could take only 1 pass at the task force. British ships therefore remained out of range, except when closing in to attack Argentine positions. For the British, the problem was their dependence on 2 aircraft carriers, as the loss of one would almost certainly have forced withdrawal. Air cover was limited to 20 short-range Sea Harrier naval jets armed with air-to-air missiles. To make up for the lack of long-range air cover, a screening force of destroyers and frigates was stationed ahead of the fleet to serve as radar pickets. However, not all of them were armed with full anti-aircraft systems or close-in weapons for shooting down incoming missiles. This left the British ships vulnerable to attack, and on May 4th, the Argentines sank the destroyer HMS Sheffield with an Exocet missile. The Argentines, meanwhile, lost some 20–30% of their planes. Thus weakened, the Argentines were unable to prevent the British from making an amphibious landing on the islands. Expecting a direct British assault, the Argentine Ground Forces commander, General Mario Menendez, centralized his forces around the capital of Stanley to protect its vital airstrip. Instead, the British Navy Task Force commander, Admiral John Woodward, decided to make their initial landing near Port San Carlos, on the northern coast of East Falkland, and then mount an overland attack on Stanley. They calculated that this would avoid casualties to the British civilian population and to the British forces. The plan was for the initial force, under the command of Brigadier Julian Thompson, to consolidate the beachhead and await the arrival of augmenting forces en route from Britain. The main idea behind the selection of San Carlos as the landing ground was the protection from submarines offered by the restricted waters of the anchorage, as well as the protection from air attacks that the surrounding high ground offered. The largest problem was, however, the distance and rugged terrain between the landing site and the main objective of Port Stanley, which would have to be traversed in some fashion by the landing force. The amphibious task force approached and arrived undetected in the objective area on the 21st of May. British troops wading ashore met no resistance from Argentine ground forces and were able to move into their planned defensive position around the area without delay. The Argentine air forces, meanwhile, kept up their attacks on the British fleet, sinking 2 frigates, a destroyer, a container ship carrying transport helicopters, and a landing ship disembarking troops. In addition, they damaged several other frigates and destroyers. Greater results might have been possible if not for the limited number of Exocet missiles available to the Argentines and their problems with getting bombs to fuse. The attrition of British ships was insufficient to stop the landing and expansion of the beachhead, and Argentine losses were too high to sustain. By the end of May, the mass attacks were no longer possible, and the Argentines could launch only 3 or 4 pairs of aircraft a day. In the end, Argentine air power by itself could neither prevent the landing nor make its cost high. From the beachhead at Port San Carlos, the British infantry advanced rapidly southward through forced marches under extremely adverse weather conditions to capture the settlements of Darwin and Goose Green. After several days of hard fighting, some of it hand-to-hand, against determined Argentine troops dug in along several ridgelines, the British succeeded in taking and occupying the high ground west of Stanley. With British forces surrounding and blockading the capital and main port, it was clear that the large Argentine garrison there was cut off and could be starved out. Menendez therefore surrendered on June 14th, effectively ending the conflict. The British captured some 11,400 Argentine prisoners during the war, all of whom were released afterward. Argentina announced that about 650 lives had been lost, while Britain lost 255. Domestically, the junta's members went from heroes to goats, were tossed out, and eventually stood trial. Argentina's military government was severely discredited by its failure to prepare and support its own military forces in the invasion that it had ordered, and civilian rule was restored to Argentina in 1983. Since then, Argentine politics have evolved into democracy. The patriotic high that Argentines enjoyed momentarily upon the invasion, as well as the depths of shame upon the defeat, was replaced by the more normal, sober, healthy ups and downs of a pluralistic society with a proper place in the world.